Before the start of every college basketball season, the Associated Press releases their preseason rankings of the top 25 teams in the country. This most recent season, the team that came in at number 1 in the AP preseason polls was the Kansas Jayhawks, who, although have been pretty solid so far this season, quite clearly haven't been able to live up to the hype as the number 1 team going into the season. And with this in mind, it got me thinking. Over the last 10 years, who are all the teams ranked number 1 going into the season, and how good did they end up actually being? Do these preseason polls actually have a solid track record of predicting who the best teams will be, or are they merely just eye candy to help build excitement before the season starts? With these questions in mind, in today's video, I'm going to be looking at every preseason number 1 team dating back to 2014 and analyzing how good they actually were, and how they ended up finishing. If you enjoy this type of content and want to see more, be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more sports content. Now with all that out of the way, let's get started. Starting things off, coming in as the preseason number 1 ranked team for the 2014-2015 season, we have the Kentucky Wildcats. After falling short of a national championship the previous season, the Wildcats were expected to bounce back in a major way. They had lost some key players from the previous season, most notably Julius Randle and James Young, who both declared for the NBA draft, but they also returned several solid contributors like Willie Cauley-Stein, the Harrison twins, among others. Additionally, with Calipari's capabilities as an elite recruiter, he managed to reload the roster with several talented freshmen, including Karl Anthony Towns, Devin Booker, Tyler Ulis, and Trey Lyles, all of whom were highly coveted 5-star recruits that would eventually go on to play in the NBA. But anyways, with a steady mixture of veteran experience alongside young talent, expectations for the Wildcats were high, and in the 2014-15 season, they'd go on to be arguably the most well-balanced team in the country, being able to light opponents up on the scoreboard while also being absolutely locked down on the defensive end. Additionally, despite all the talent on the roster, they all played very unselfishly. Nobody really established themselves as the star of the team, and there were pretty even contributions across the board. So on any given night, you never knew who was going to have a big game. And given the crazy amount of versatility the team had, this made them an absolute nightmare to game plan against. Kentucky would go on to steamroll through their regular season schedule, eventually finishing as SEC champions with a perfect 34-0 record and maintaining their number 1 ranking in the country. And going into the March Madness tournament as one of the favorites to win it all, they picked up right where they left off in the regular season, advancing to the Elite 8 pretty easily with 3 dominant wins over Hampton, Cincinnati, and West Virginia. And after pulling out a close game against Notre Dame, they found themselves in the Final Four against a very talented and experienced Wisconsin team. The game would be a dogfight throughout, with Kentucky fighting back from countless deficits, but in the end, they would eventually run out of steam, ending their perfect season with a 71-64 loss. Moving on now to the 2015 season, ranked as the number 1 team in the preseason polls was the North Carolina Tar Heels. And the main reason why this team was regarded so highly going into the season was the fact that they returned so many talented veterans that had vast experience at the college level. This includes guys like Bryce Johnson, Marcus Page, Isaiah Hicks, and Kennedy Meeks. Not to mention younger guys like Justin Jackson and Joel Berry, who provided a scoring punch, were returning as well. Combine the highly experienced and talented roster with an incredible coach in Roy Williams, and you've got a team destined to do great things. Throughout the season, North Carolina was heavily reliant on their high-powered and versatile offense to dominate their opponent. They weren't a bad defensive team by any means, but it was just clear that the offense was the engine that made this team run. There were just so many guys that could get to a bucket, with 4 players on the team averaging over 12 points a game, and their high-powered offense would eventually lead them to an ACC championship behind an impressive 28-6 record. Moving into the March Madness tournament, it quickly became clear that all this experience, maturity, and chemistry the Tar Heels had gave them a huge advantage, as they'd go on to make a statement run to the championship game, knocking off Florida Gulf Coast, Providence, Indiana, Notre Dame, and Syracuse along the way. Now, only one team stood in their way of a championship, the Villanova Wildcats. And in what is widely considered one of the greatest college basketball games of all time, after a back-and-forth contest throughout, the Tar Heels hit a huge clutch shot in the final seconds to tie up the game. However, shortly after, Villanova's Chris Jenkins hit a dagger buzzer-beater 3 to win the game, ending UNC's season in heartbreaking fashion.
Gives it to Jenkins for the championship.
For the 2016-2017 season, the preseason number 1 ranked team was the Duke Blue Devils. Although they had lost their star freshman Brandon Ingram to the NBA draft, there was still quite a bit of firepower returning, including their leading scorer from the previous season in Grayson Allen, alongside key contributors like Luke Kennard and Emil Jefferson. In addition to their returners, however, it was the incoming recruiting class that really got people excited about this Duke team. Headlined by 5 stars Jason Tatum, Harry Giles, Frank Jackson, and Marquez Bolden, many people expected the young guys to be key key contributors for the upcoming season. And when the regular season tipped off, two of the freshmen, Tatum and Jackson, were more than up to the task and went on to be key contributors. Additionally, the returning guys like Allen, Kennard, and Jefferson continued to be productive, which really added stability to a relatively young and inexperienced team. With the combination of all the talent on the roster, combined with the coaching of Coach K, Duke fielded one of the most potent offenses in the country that could score effectively at all three levels. They would stumble a bit near the end of conference play, losing 3 of their last 4, but they'd finish out the season strong, winning 4 straight in the ACC tournament. And after bringing home the conference championship, many people thought that momentum could potentially carry over into the March Madness tournament and that they could make a deep run. Unfortunately for the Blue Devils, however, after a first-round victory over Troy, they would shortly after see their season ended in the second round by South Carolina, becoming yet another preseason #1 ranked team that was unable to get the job done. Coming in as the preseason #1 ranked team for the 2017 season, we have our first repeat of the video with the Duke Blue Devils once again earning the top spot. After a disappointing end of the previous season and losing a vast majority of their team to graduation, the NBA draft, and the transfer portal, this 2017 iteration of the Duke Blue Devils was bound to look very different from the 2016 squad. With the exception of Grayson Allen being the only notable returner from last year's team, Coach K was given the monumental task of rebuilding almost an entire team from scratch. But as the common saying goes, Duke doesn't rebuild, they simply reload. And the turnover from the 2016 season to 2017 is yet another prime example of that, as they managed to haul in the consensus #1 recruiting class in the country, featuring several prominent 5-stars like Marvin Bagley, Wendell Carter, Trayvon Duval, and Gary Trent Jr. And going into the regular season, despite there being a ton of skeptics claiming a team led by true freshmen was bound to fail, the youthful Blue Devils quickly put all those doubts to rest. The freshman combination of Bagley, Carter, Duval, and Trent proved to be incredibly effective, as they possessed one of the most well-rounded offensive attacks in all of college basketball, alongside being very solid defensively as well. They'd go on to finish the season with an impressive 26-7 record, which would be good enough to get them an at-large berth to the NCAA tournament. And in the tournament, the freshmen alongside Grayson Allen would fight all the way to the Elite 8 with wins over Iona, Rhode Island, and Syracuse. Their season, however, would eventually come to an end shortly after, as they'd suffer a hard-fought loss to the Kansas Jayhawks. Moving now into the 2018-2019 season, the team ranked #1 in the preseason polls was yet another blue blood school, the Kansas Jayhawks. Going into the season, this was a team that you just knew had so much championship potential, and it doesn't take much digging to find out why. Although they had lost some great players like Devontae Graham and Svi Mikhailiuk to the NBA draft, they managed to retain several other key players like Udoka Azubuike and LaGerald Vick, who were all conference performers the previous season, along with other promising young talent like Silvio De Sousa and Marcus Garrett waiting for their shot as well. Not to mention, the Jayhawks also made several great offseason additions like Dedrick Lawson via the transfer portal, alongside a solid recruiting haul featuring some prominent names like Quentin Grimes, Devon Dotson, as well as Ochai Agbaji. And with the combination of all the returning pieces alongside the addition of several talented freshmen, this was a team that had the potential to be absolutely deadly if everything came together. Unfortunately for Kansas, however, they'd see quite a bit of adversity throughout the regular season, with much of that stemming from various unforeseen changes to their roster. Silvio De Sousa was ruled ineligible for most of the season due to an ongoing investigation regarding his amateur status. LaGerald Vick had to leave the team mid-season to handle personal matters, and Azubuike's season was cut short after undergoing wrist surgery. These were all key players in the lineup that were now gone, but luckily for the Jayhawks, they had a lot of depth and talent on the roster that were able to step up and keep the team afloat in spite of all the challenges facing them. They'd go on to finish the season with a respectable 25-9 record, but would end up missing out on the Big 12 championship for the first time in 14 years. Nonetheless, they'd receive an at-large berth to March Madness, however they wouldn't make it very far, because after a first-round win over Northeastern, they'd go on to be upsetted by the 14th seeded Auburn Tigers in the second round, thus putting an end to their season. Getting to the halfway point now, serving as the #1 ranked preseason team for the 2019 season was the Michigan State Spartans. After making a run to the Elite 8 the previous season, there were actually some that believed 2019 might actually be a bit of a rebuilding year for MSU, due to the fact that several starters from the previous year were moving on, alongside speculation that reigning Big Ten Player of the Year Cassius Winston could possibly test NBA waters. Winston, however, would ultimately make the decision to return to school, which was obviously a very big deal. Not only that, but with other players like Xavier Xavier Tillman and Aaron Henry expected to take a big leap, combined with one of their top scorers, Josh Langford, looking to bounce back from injury, all of a sudden the Spartans looked to have a solid core of players returning, at least on paper. Add into the fold incoming freshmen Rocket Watts, Malik Hall, and of course legendary coach Tom Izzo, and this now looked like another Michigan State team primed to make a run at the national championship. Moving into the regular season, it got off to a bit of a sour note as it was announced the prolific scoring guard Josh Langford would have to miss the entire season due to injury. But luckily the Spartans were for the most part able to fill the scoring void with other players. With Cassius Winston, who was having another Player of the Year caliber season at the helm, the Spartans proved to be one of the most well-rounded and balanced teams in college basketball that year. They weren't as flashy or exciting as other teams by any means, but they were very well coached and did what they needed to do in order to win, eventually finishing with a solid 22-9 record. Unfortunately, things would shortly after come to a screeching halt as the NCAA was forced to shut down the remainder of the season amidst the COVID pandemic. It sucks we never got to see how far this team would have gone in the postseason, but this was just another example of the harsh consequences faced by several teams in that 2019 season due to the COVID pandemic. For the 2020 season, coming in as the #1 ranked team in the preseason polls was the Gonzaga Bulldogs. If there's one team that got screwed over the most from the COVID shutdown the previous year, it might just be Gonzaga. Before the shutdown, they were in the midst of an incredible 31-2 season and were seen as one of the heavy favorites to potentially win the national championship. So going into this 2020 season, they were on a mission to chase a title they never had the opportunity to last year. With key contributors like Drew Timme, Corey Kispert, and Joel Ayayi running it back, alongside bringing in guys like Andrew Nembhard and Aaron Cook via the transfer portal, this was a team loaded with both talent and experience. Now add into the mix a stellar recruiting class headlined by Jalen Suggs, the highest rated recruit in program history, and this team had all the tools to be even better than the previous season. And when the regular season kicked off, the team by all metrics managed to live up to the hype. Timme and Kispert were putting up career numbers, Suggs looked to be one of the best players in the country as a true freshman, and the whole team overall just played really well together. You could just tell their chemistry was off the charts as they moved like a well-oiled machine, having what many considered to be the best offense in the country, while also being really sound defensively. They'd go on to finish the season with a perfect 26-0 record, and when the NCAA tournament rolled around, they were once again seen as one of the heavy favorites to win it all. And in the tournament, Gonzaga was able to steamroll through their first 4 games with wins over Norfolk State, Oklahoma, Creighton, and USC. And after a huge last-second win in the semifinals over UCLA, they moved on to the championship where they'd have to go up against a Baylor squad that was just as talented and experienced. Unfortunately for Gonzaga, they'd end up being just too overmatched by a Bears team, firing on all cylinders, as they'd fall in the final game of the season with a score of 86-70. Running it back as the preseason #1 ranked team for 2021, we once again have the Gonzaga Bulldogs. After falling just short of a title the previous season, the Zags were eager to get another opportunity at redemption. With this in mind, however, it would certainly be no easy task, as they'd have to replace 7 players from last year's roster. This included several key players like Corey Kispert, Joel Ayayi, as well as their freshman stud Jalen Suggs. Despite all the talent heading out though, they still did have a nice core coming back, most notably with Andrew Nembhard, Julian Strother, and of course, Drew Timme. Additionally, they brought in the talented guard Rasir Bolton from the transfer portal, as well as an absolutely loaded recruiting class headlined by their trio of 5-stars Chet Holmgren, Hunter Salas, and Nolan Hickman. And similar to the previous year, the Bulldogs absolutely steamrolled their way through the regular season, once again having an extremely efficient and well-balanced combination of offense and defense. They'd go on to finish the season with a 26-3 record, and for the second year in a row were one of the top seeds going into March Madness. Early on in the tournament, everything was going just as expected as they picked up 2 wins over Georgia State and Memphis to advance to the Sweet 16. However, going into their 3rd round matchup against Arkansas, despite a valiant effort by Drew Timme and company, they'd wind up coming up short, suffering a devastating season-ending 74-68 loss to the Razorbacks. Getting near the end now, the team ranked #1 in the preseason polls for the 2022 season was the North Carolina Tar Heels. Fresh off of their surprise run to the national championship the previous season as an 8 seed where they came up just short of the title, the Tar Heels came into the following year with tons of expectations. Although they had lost one of their key players in Brady Manick to graduation, overall the team remained mostly intact, as they returned 3 of their top scorers in Caleb Love, RJ Davis, and Armando Bacot. They had some other solid pieces as well and brought in a solid recruiting class, but at the end of the day, it was the previously mentioned victory of Love, Davis, and Bacot that really got most people excited. During the regular season, however, although the big 3 put up solid production, the team as a whole struggled mightily, especially on the offensive side where they were one of the worst shooting teams in the entire country. Overall, the Tar Heels struggled to find any kind of consistency the entire season and would wind up finishing with a 20-13 record, a very disappointing result by North Carolina standards. To make matters worse, they'd wind up being eliminated in the second round of the ACC tournament, which resulted in them failing to get an invite to the NCAA tournament, becoming the first preseason #1 team to miss out on March Madness since the field expanded in 1985. And to put the nail in the coffin, despite receiving an invite to participate in the NIT tournament as consolation, they'd ultimately decide to turn it down, thus putting an end to one of the most disappointing seasons not just in North Carolina history, but college basketball history in general when you take into account all the hype they had going into the year. And now to finish up, coming in as the most recent preseason #1 team, outside of this year of course, is the Kansas Jayhawks. After a disappointing second round loss the previous season in the NCAA tournament, in the following offseason, this was a Kansas team that would end up needing to be rebuilt from top to bottom. They had lost a ton of talent, totaling 9 players in total, most notably with their star freshman Grady Dick and consensus All-American Jalen Wilson to the NBA draft. As such, head coach Bill Self really locked in his attention on the transfer portal, as well as bringing in a strong freshman class. And overall, the Jayhawks were able to bring in several solid players like Hunter Dickinson via the transfer portal, as well as talented freshmen like Johnny Furphy. Additionally, there were some players returning from last year's team that were expected to take the next step, including Kevin McCullough and KJ Adams. When the regular season tipped off, the Jayhawks got off to a blistering hot start, sitting at 13-1 going into conference play. However, once they started their Big 12 slate, the team became highly inconsistent on both ends of the floor. They'd get a big-time win over a ranked opponent one game, but then immediately turn around and lose to a team they were highly favored again. And at the conclusion of the regular season, they'd finished with a conference record of just 10-8, which marked the most conference losses the program had suffered in a season since 1989. But even after losing their first game in the Big 12 tournament, Kansas would luckily still receive an at-large bid to the NCAA tournament. Their March Madness run wouldn't last very long, however, as after a close first-round win over Samford, they'd proceed to get blown out in their second-round game against Gonzaga, putting an end to their highly disappointing season. So that was every preseason #1 ranked team over the last 10 years and how their seasons actually ended up playing out. For those not keeping track at home, of the 10 teams in this video, 8 of them would receive an invite to the NCAA tournament and win their first round game, with 3 of the 8 advancing to the Final Four and 2 teams going all the way to the championship game. In the end though, despite some coming close, none of them would actually end up taking home the championship. I think this just goes to show that any kind of preseason ranking should always be taken with a grain of salt, since in the world of college basketball, quite literally anything can happen. So with that in mind, perhaps the Kansas Jayhawks can finish out the year strong and be the first preseason #1 team in quite a while to get the job done and win the title. Be sure to leave a like on the video if you enjoyed and subscribe to the channel for more sports content. If you have any thoughts on any of the teams in this video or have suggestions for future videos, be sure to leave a comment down below. This is HCP signing off. As always, I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'm out. Peace.